You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Good morning, and welcome to our webinar on the Shroud of Turin. I'm Sister Marisha Weber, the Director of the Office of Consecrated Life for the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And I'm delighted to be co-hosting this inspiring presentation with Dr. Tom Sheehan, Director of the Institute of Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, which is an organization of scientists and theologians who are interested in the intersection of faith and science, as well as Louis Guild of the Catholic Medical Association, a local guild of healthcare providers with a leading voice on applying the principles of Catholic faith to medicine. A few practicals for this webinar. First, you may come in and out anytime you wish. We ask that if you need to depart for a time, that you turn off your video. We also encourage you to add questions that you can type in the chat room. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon that says chat. So click on that whenever you want to type in a question or a comment. And they will be addressed by our presenters at the end of their presentations. So I'm delighted to have you join us this morning. Apparently there's about 110 of us out there coming in for this webinar. So let's begin. Father Nickolai, would you lead us in an opening prayer, please?
Certainly, I'd be glad to. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. We thank you and bless you, Lord our God. In times past, you spoke in many varied ways through the prophets, but in this, the final age, you have spoken through your Son to reveal to all nations the riches of your grace. May we who have met to ponder the Scriptures, to consider, to contemplate your mighty deeds, be filled with the knowledge of your will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, and pleasing you as we should in all things, may we bear fruit in every good work. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Okay, Tom, just for a second, I'm going to do something real quick. Hang on. Okay, Tom, go ahead.
Okay, well, as Sister Marisha said, ITEST, the Institute of Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, is a co-sponsor of this event, and it's right down our line because it brings together faith and science, and that's what ITEST does. We want to bring people to an understanding that science is not the enemy of faith, but is rather a compatible and complementary path to the one truth that faith and science each pursue in a compatible way. So that's what ITEST does, and that's why we're happy to be co-sponsoring this particular seminar. Now, to start things off right away, rather than get into a discussion of our function, I want to introduce Father John Nickolai. He is our principal speaker this morning first, although after he talks, Mark Antonacci will come on, and I'll come back to introduce Mark as well. Father Nickolai currently serves as associate pastor at St. Rose Philippine Duchesne Parish in Florissant, Missouri. His prior assignments were at St. Joseph Parish in Imperial and at St. Ferdinand Parish in Florissant. Well, before entering the seminary, he studied fine arts and got an undergraduate degree, a BFA, from Washington University in 1999. Then, his master's thesis at Kenrick-Glennon Seminary was entitled, Why This Face? The Shroud of Turin, and icons of Christ. So this is where his expertise comes from, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. His talk today is entitled, Not Made by Hands, a Mysterious Image in Legends, Liturgies, and Paintings. Father Nickolai.
Thank you, Tom. It occurs to me, I've been thinking about this and how I sort of got interested in it in the first place, and I remembered that it goes back to one of the parishes I was assigned to live at as a seminarian. Some of us were sitting around one evening, and that was the question that came up. The question, why is it that face? That is, why does everyone know, as it were, that a certain picture, a certain kind of face is, or is at least supposed to be, the face of Jesus? One of the things that's intriguing about it is that Scripture itself is silent on the matter. And the earliest tradition is unclear, or at least at variance. So, of course, I love to talk about the fathers. So, we look at someone like St. Justin Martyr, for example, or Clement of Alexandria, and they cite passages like Isaiah 52 about the suffering servant, or Isaiah 53, again, where it says, he had in him no stately bearing that we should look at him. I noticed just a few weeks ago that passage came up in the Divine Office for the Triduum. I think it was Holy Saturday. So the Church's liturgy links that passage directly to the Passion of Christ. But then again, so those are the passages that some fathers highlight when they think of what Jesus looked like. But then other people like St. Basil the Great, St. John Chrysostom, St. Augustine, they go and look at Psalm 45. You are the fairest of the children of men. So again, there's these interesting different ways that the early tradition imagined the face of the Lord. And then the earliest art record, it has Jesus youthful and beardless, like the Greeks and Romans pictured their gods. So, for instance, the very early paintings have the figure that's supposed to be Christ looks in some cases like Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god whose youth is renewed every day at dawn. The early art record has the Lord, in some way like the Greeks and Romans pictured their gods. Or again, there's the Good Shepherd, who's kind of a youthful figure often. In some cases, Christ is seen dressed as a philosopher, sort of sometimes bearded, sometimes not. And then it changes. It changes starting in the 6th century, starting in the 500s. And it's then that the portrait of Christ that we're familiar with begins to appear. In fact, in the course of my research, I found one art historian who said, it's as if a decree were issued throughout Christendom that established the definitive face of Jesus to be used in art. And yet, as far as we know, there isn't any such decree, at least not in written form. So let's look at what the Scripture says, first of all. And the 3 synoptic Gospels are all agreed in saying that Jesus was buried in a sindon, a Greek word that signifies a linen cloth after the crucifixion. St. Matthew uses a Greek verb, anatelixin, which means wrapped, to describe what was done with the body. That's the verb that St. Luke also uses. Mark uses anelasin, which is another Greek word that has connotations of being wrapped in some way. St. John's Gospel uses the verb eneson, which means something more like bound. And John also uses the Greek noun, the plural noun, ophonia, which we usually render in our readings something like burial cloths, plural. After the resurrection, there's no mention in Matthew or Mark of cloths, but St. Luke describes Peter's discovery again of the ophonia in the empty tomb. So there's a kind of there's a range of meaning for that word sinden. It's the word that St. Mark uses to describe what is left behind by that mysterious figure who flees at the arrest of Jesus, and it seems like he sort of wriggles out of his clothes, and as St. Mark says, runs away naked. So that what he leaves behind is also sinden in that gospel. Sinden is also the word for the sheet that St. Peter sees in Acts chapter 10, his vision of a cloth that comes down out of heaven holding the clean and unclean animals. We also find sinden used in ancient writings as a word for sailcloth. We also see it used for mummy wrappings. It's worth noting that St. John also uses, also mentions, if we'll think of the Gospels that we happen to have been reading recently in the Easter season, St. John mentions also the head covering cloth, in the sudarium, which we often see rendered into our English translation as something like napkin or handkerchief. And St. John also uses that word in the account about Lazarus. So remember, he says Lazarus comes out bound, hand and foot, with a cloth over his face. So there's also a sudarium in the case of Lazarus. And the verb that's applied to the sudarium in Lazarus's case is perideo, a Greek verb that, if you can see that prefix peri, it means around. So in some sense, that cloth is wrapped around the face and head of Lazarus. So to get from the times of the events in the gospel, to get from the times in the gospel to the 500s, we have to go to the city of Edessa, which corresponds to a place called Urfa in modern day Turkey. And Edessa is one of those places that's associated by tradition with a disciple. So we think of how tradition associates, for instance, St. Thomas with India, or St. John with Ephesus. Edessa is linked to Jude, who's also known as Thaddeus or Addai. So Edessa is significant in one way because it's known to have been one of the first districts of the empire that was Christianized. There is in existence a history of the city, and it mentions a flood in the year 201. And the history specifically says the flood damaged the church of the Christians. So that suggests that not only had the faith reached Edessa by 200 or 201, but that it was established enough to have a permanent and publicly recognized building that, in a sense, was known to belong to the Christians, to be the Christians' church. So that's striking, because consider that's a century before the Edict of Milan, for instance. And one possibility that explains it is that there was a miracle that took place that benefited the king of Edessa. So between the years 13 and 50, Edessa was ruled by a king Abgar. And the church historian Eusebius, who lived in the 400s, found in the Edessa archives evidence of some kind of communication between Christ or perhaps the apostles and Abgar. So this, of course, there's some legendary material in the story, and there's varied versions of it. But the broad outlines of it have the king falling ill and sending either a message or a messenger to this famed miracle worker Jesus he's heard about. And Jesus, in reply, offers to send Thaddeus, or at least, and in one version, that's how it goes. In another version, Jesus presses a cloth to his face and leaves an image on it, and then gives that to the king's messenger. It's worth noting that this account that has Jesus pressing a cloth to his face and leaving an image uses a word tetradiplon, a Greek word. And this is the only known use of that word in all of Greek literature. And again, it's a compound. We can see tetradiplon. So tetra, it's four, and diplon folded. So it means doubled in four, or folded over four times, or folded to make four layers, or something like that. And there is corroborating evidence of this story as early as the year 429, because it's mentioned in a letter that we have that was written to St. Augustine in that year. Further evidence, further facts about Edessa. In the year 190, Clement of Alexandria lists Edessa as the burial site of Addai or Thaddeus, in a kind of list that Clement was making of where the apostles ended up and were buried. So then in the year 544, that's the key year. In 544, there's a portrait of Christ discovered. And one of the words that's applied to that portrait is akeropoietos. And that's another very rare Greek compound. We see it in a few places in Scripture. For one place, it's opposite. So there's that "a" at the beginning that means not, that sort of negates the word in Greek. So it's opposite. Keropoietos is in the Greek version of Isaiah chapter 2, in which he mentions the statues of idols. So Isaiah says the statues of idols are keropoietos, that is, made by human hands. So akeropoietos is not made by human hands. So one place that it appears in the New Testament is in the second letter to the Corinthians. It's applied to the resting place of the just there. Another place is in Mark chapter 14, in the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. There's that phrase, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise up a new one, not made by human hands." Again, the word there is akeropoietos, not made by human hands. So there's that discovery of some kind of mysterious image. And the story goes, the sort of legend / history of its discovery talks about a siege. The city of Edessa was under siege by a Persian army. And it was a desperate situation, and the bishop, the local bishop, had some kind of dream or vision that guided him. That guided him to a room that was bricked up above the city gate. So they sort of break into this bricked up room, and that's where they find that image.
That's correct. Okay. I did it right now. Now, right, it's mute.
So why might it have been bricked up? Why might it have disappeared at some point? Well, we do have evidence that that after Abgar, about whom the legend is written, several of his sons reigned after him, Abgar Jr., as it were, and a few others. So somewhere in that line of succession, we know that one of those sons of Abgar kind of reverted to paganism. So perhaps Christianity was embraced very early and then fell into his favor again. In any case, there's this image that's found bricked up over the city gate. And the story goes further that there was some kind of ritual was done with the image, some kind of prayer was prayed sort of around it or in its presence, or it was venerated in some way, and the Persian attackers' siege works collapsed, and the city was saved from the siege by this image. That again, all we know of it in itself is that it's an image of Christ. It's for some reason thought to be a kerapoetos, not made by human hands. So we go a little further in the history, and this story is known. For instance, we have a sermon by Pope Stephen, who was elected in the year 769, that references this image, this item. And Pope Stephen says in this sermon, and in a way he's sort of imaginatively quoting Jesus. He says, "If you wish to see my human face, here is a linen on which you can see not only the features of my face, but the stature of my whole body, divinely formed." Jesus, Stephen goes on to say, stretched his whole body on a cloth white as snow, on which the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his whole body was so divinely transformed that it was sufficient for those who could not see the Lord bodily in the flesh to see the transfiguration made on the cloth. And this sermon by the Pope goes on to say, the cloth remains incorrupt in Edessa. So further on in the writings, in the written record, we can see that also in the 8th century was the time when St. John of Damascus lived. St. John of Damascus, the great defender of icons, of holy images. John of Damascus mentions this mysterious image on linen and uses the Greek word haimatzion, which is usually indicates a garment that includes several yards of material. The next significant thing that happens is that the Byzantine emperor comes to want this cloth with this image for the royal palace at Constantinople. So he sends an army to Edessa to get it, by bargain or battle, because by this time Edessa had fallen into the hands of an occupying force. So the Constantinople party makes this deal with the new occupiers of Edessa, and the image, the cloth, is exchanged for 1,200 silver coins and the release of 200 prisoners. So that's in. So then what happens is on August 8th, in the year 944, there's a liturgy celebrated to welcome and to enthrone, as it were, this image. And here's the sermon that was given. Here's an excerpt from a sermon that was given on the occasion of that liturgy. It says, "These are truly things of beauty. They contain the color of the imprint of Christ, further embellished by drops of blood that gushed from his side." So then the emperor commissioned a kind of official court history for the cloth. And that history says, when he was about to appear before him, Thaddeus placed that very likeness on his own face, and so came before Abgar. So again, the legend or the story of the miraculous healing of the king, who either sent a messenger or wrote to the miracle worker Jesus, involves either Thaddeus, Adai, Jude coming, or this cloth being brought, and in this version, it suggests that Jude or the messenger that Jesus sent in some way put the put the cloth over himself, sort of wore it as a kind of costume or disguise, because of course it's a full body image, and then appeared before the king. And by this intervention of this miraculous image, the king was healed of his grave sickness. And that's sort of thought to be how the legend or the accounts indicate, and that's in some way how Christianity won this kind of early favor and acceptance in Edessa. This official history also goes on to say that there is a, quote, moist secretion without coloring or painter's art made on the linen cloth. We also have an account of the emperor's sons going and sort of making an official viewing of this image. And it's striking that they say in this account, they say that they find the image blurry. It's distinct at one distance and less distinct at another distance, which again is kind of suggestive, considering what we know of the object we have today that's called the Shroud of Turin. There's further sort of interesting historical notes that involve the royal palace, the empire, and references to this image or cloth. For instance, in the year 1080, there's known to have been a request for military aid. Again, some kind of aid from other parts of the empire for some kind of invasion, and that request mentions as sort of an additional motivation that there's this great treasure in the royal palace, that among other things, won't you send military aid to help guard this treasure among other things. There's an official inventory made of the royal palace's possessions in 1150, and that also mentions this cloth with an image on it. In the year 1201, there's some kind of riot, some kind of unrest breaks out, and a sort of angry mob forms at the palace gates, and a deacon by the name of Nicholas Meserites goes out to sort of make peace, to try to dissuade the mob. And among the things he mentions again is this treasure that they have in the royal palace, this relic. And it's worth noting that Nicholas Meserites uses the Greek word apeirolepton, and that would be best translated into English as something like without an outline or outlineless. Because again, you can see the that means without or not, and peri again, around. So whatever this image is that Nicholas is using to appeal to the mob, it's in some way has no outline, it's outlineless. Next we come to the year 1204, which is when the Fourth Crusade happens. And again, we have the journal of one of the Crusader knights named Robert de Clary, and he writes of seeing something. He writes that he saw the shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped, which was stood up straight every Friday, so that the features of the Lord could be plainly seen there. And then his, as we know, the Fourth Crusade, wasn't exactly glorious. The journal goes on to say that after the sack of the city, it says nobody knew what became of this cloth. So we have this treasure that Constantinople had. Apparently, it vanishes in the year 1204, right around the time of the Fourth Crusade and the sack of the city. We jump ahead about 100 years to the year 1307, and it's then that the King of France calls for the arrest of the Templar Knights, one of the things he accuses them of is idolatry. And they're specifically accused of worshiping the image of a red-bearded man, which again is suggestive. If we think of the object we're familiar with today as the Shroud of Turin, it's a kind of rust-colored image in the positive. Of course, that striking image that we also see a lot is actually the photographic negative that's black and white. But the object itself is white with a kind of rust or reddish discoloring on it. And on this occasion of this investigation of the Templar Knights, we have in existence a transcript of the trial. And part of the testimony mentions a ceremony that happened in the year 1287. And this testimony mentions a long linen cloth on which was impressed the figure of a man, and this person being sort of initiated into the Templars through the ceremony is told to kiss the feet of the image 3 times. So again, there's all these very suggestive things, these sort of tantalizing hints of something throughout the historical and liturgical record, some kind of mysterious image that has these unusual features of being outlineless, of being not made with hands, and of having no evidence of a painter's art working on it. So that sort of down through history, that brings us to the middle of the 14th century. And it's around then that the object we know as the Shroud of Turin begins to be pretty well documented. In the year 1354, is when the Bishop of Lire in France is sort of spurred or provoked by a sort of controversy to investigate a purported burial shroud of Christ that's being put on display by the Descharny family, which is again an interesting that name should come up, because the name of one of the Templars executed in 1307 after that trial was named Geoffrey Descharny. So there's this intriguing sort of chain of references down through the historical record that eventually ends up leading to a French Crusader knight, and then an investigation of Templar knights in France that involves this mysterious image of a red-bearded man, an initiation, and then again one of the Templars who was investigated and executed shares a name with the family that begins displaying what we know today as the Shroud of Turin in France in the middle of the 14th century. So that brings us to the sort of artistic evidence itself, or the what we might call the painted record or the artistic record, because there are pictures that are known that have the reputation of having been copied from the Edessa image, and they all share in common a few things. For instance, they have a lot of times they'll have a brownish or at least monochrome image. So it's not naturalistic, these images that are copied from the Edessa image, but they're a brownish or monochrome, and it's always a face in frontal view. So no profile, no 3/4 view, always very frontal, always very straight on. And then something else that's worth noting, especially as we consider, comparing these very old images that have the reputation of being copied from Edessa's image to the object before us as the Shroud of Turin today. They always have this strange landscape orientation. So that means there's often a face in the middle, and then a kind of blank space on either side. And it's it looks strange on its own, because you think, well, why would there be this landscape orientation for a portrait? I think of sort of the reverse of if it drives anyone else crazy when people shoot video portrait mode on their phone. But they all have this landscape orientation. But then we think of what we know as a shroud today, and we know that it has these basically permanent creases in it, that it seems to have been kept folded for a long time, and perhaps folded from top to bottom, and then in half, and then in half again, to produce 4 double layers of cloth, again doubled in 4, tetradiplon, and that leaves only the face showing, and the cloth isn't folded across at all, ever. There aren't any sort of vertical creases on the shroud. There's only these horizontal creases. So the shroud itself, according to the creases that are on it now, it looks like it would have been possible to see just the face and then kind of blank space on either side of it. So there's images that look like that. There's an archway in a church in Turkey from the 11th century that has that strange kind of image on it. Again, there's a painting from the year 945 that was made to, again, commissioned. They made a big deal in Constantinople about this image coming to commemorate the Edessa cloth's arrival in Constantinople. So it shows Abgar holding the cloth, and again, there's a strange blank space on either side of the face in the cloth. Again, getting to comparisons with icons we can see today, and with the face of the man on the shroud, there's a kind of twist of the mouth that's called the sardonic smile, apparently in pathology circles, because it's apparently what happens with for one thing, it happens with victims of tetanus or lockjaw. There's these spasms of pain, and they contract the upper lip. So again, that kind of phenomenon might explain, or at least it matches some of the more severe-looking icons of Christ that are around. If you can picture the 11th century Pantocrator in the dome of the church at Daphni in Greece, it's often described as a kind of severe, and judgmental-looking figure. But it's possible that reflects somehow the sort of pain that's visible in the face of the man in the cloth, to keen observation. We think also of the 6th century icon from the St. Catherine Monastery at Mount Sinai, and again that icon has very striking features. The pupils of the face aren't at the same level. There's an arched eyebrow over the left eye. And one side of the mustache kind of droops at a different angle from the other. Again, matching some of the features we see on the Shroud of Turin. The shroud and icons also share, in many cases, the sort of forked beard, the beard that comes to 2 points, a straight nose and enlarged nostrils, one raised eyebrow. Many icons even replicate a line across the throat that is actually just an irregularity in the cloth itself. They often have a kind of triangle-shaped mark on the bridge of the nose. Look for that when you look at icons in the future. They often show a beardless area below the lower lip, a short tuft of hair on the forehead, and long hair parted to each side of the face. And another feature that I think is so interesting that we see on icons beginning very early are the large staring eyes. Because remember again that image that's made the Shroud of Turin so striking in the last century or so is the photographic negative, that black and white image that shows us so clearly a face in repose. So if you can picture that black and white image, since it's the negative, let me see here. Right, what's light on the cloth itself is dark on the negative. So what's light on the cloth would look like, or rather what's dark on the cloth could be read as the pupils, and what's light could be read as the whites around the eyes. So that say if someone was copying an image from the cloth itself, it might not be recognized immediately that those eyes have closed lids, as we can see so clearly in the photographic negative. So these artists they saw that and they produced these staring wide open eyes, and in a sense in a way it's as one of my art teachers said in college, it's a mistake, but a marvelous mistake, because they end up producing this face that's alert and commanding, because they make it have these staring wide open eyes, because that's what they see on the positive, and we can read as closed eyes. What they would look open to those looking at the cloth in the positive. And again, remember that that if, for instance, some of the ancient artists were looking at this cloth when it was folded up for so long to produce those permanent creases, they would have just seen the face. In many cases, they wouldn't have had the whole body to give it a kind of context. So again, they would have seen, in a sense, it's striking considering Easter and the Easter season. They would have been looking at an image of the Lord in repose, and yet they would have seen also him alive. That's why I think if it's a mistake, as it were, it's a marvelous mistake, a sort of providential one, as it were. That they always, looking at this image, they always painted a picture of the Lord alive and in command. So we have all these features that we see throughout the art historical record. They're seen in a 6th century gospel book illustration from Syria. They're seen in the 10th century Church of St. Angelo in Italy, the 8th century St. Pontianus Church, the 6th century St. Apollinaire in Ravenna, Italy. And that's a striking one because northern Italy was, in the 6th century when that church was built, it was under the control of the Byzantine Empire. So of course it's likely that artists from the Eastern world, from the Byzantine world, would have been brought in to decorate it and to produce it. Another striking feature of the man in what we know as the Shroud of Turin today is that it looks like his left leg is shorter than his right. And what we know now, of course, is that's the result of one leg being fixed over the other on the cross, and then after rigor mortis set in, it couldn't be completely straightened, so it produces this this appearance that one leg is significantly shorter than the other because of the rigor mortis. And what's so striking about that is that we know something about the So what's striking is, for one thing, some of this convention arose in Byzantine icons that shows Christ indeed with one leg shorter than another. And in some cases, even the infant Christ is portrayed as being born with one withered leg. And another thing we know about the missionaries sent out from Constantinople. In the year 988, Orthodoxy was made this sort of official religion of Russia by the conversion of the Tsar. And so priests were sent out from Constantinople to sort of instruct this new territory in their new faith of the land. And we know that their preaching included this note that they preached Christ as lame in his right leg. And of course, what they made of that was that, he was suffering for men's sins to that extent, so that he would even take on such afflictions as being crippled. So that's again this interesting thing that we know some of the missionary preachers said, and where did they get that idea from? Well, possibly again from some image that they believed in some way to be authoritative, to be telling a significant truth about Jesus. Oh, and so what this leads to is another artistic convention that we see in what's called the Russian cross. So we think of all the different kinds of crosses there are in Christian art. And if you look up the Russian cross, you'll see that it has a second cross piece. And the second cross piece lower on the cross is slanted, as if to accommodate the body being nailed to the cross having one leg shorter than the other. Again, before the year 1000, painted crosses in the Byzantine world showed Christ very upright and very sort of rigidly with his head facing forward. But after around the year 1000, and again, remember that the Odessa cloth arrives in Constantinople in 940. An artistic convention called the Byzantine curve develops. And the Byzantine curve, and again, I remember when I gave this presentation at our own parish church, I turned around and looked at our crucifix above the altar, and I saw that it's at least slightly present there. So this convention has stayed with us, I think. But the Byzantine curve shows the figure on the cross not rigid and straight up and down, but the head is tilted over the right shoulder, and the body is curved, and it produces a kind of C shape. And again, it's as if the executioners, when they were crucifying a man with legs of different lengths, sort of pulled down the shorter one and forced the whole body into a curve. And again, we see this Byzantine curve appear in church mosaics as early as 1020. Again, another piece of the artistic record we have is a prayer book that's called the Pray Manuscript. And what's striking about the Pray Manuscript is that it has a scene in it of the taking down of Jesus from the cross, and the burial cloth is there in the scene, and it shows it has a kind of zigzag pattern on the cloth, or what's sometimes called a staircase pattern. It looks like there's these overlapping staircases drawn onto the cloth. And again, that's strange detail, but we know the weaving pattern of the linen on the Shroud of Turin has a pattern called 3-to-1 herringbone twill, which is a pattern that produces a kind of staircase, sort of repeated staircase pattern. The Pray manuscript, and the Pray manuscript is from the early 1200s, I think. It has it shows, and again in that same burial cloth in the picture, these mysterious 3 holes in a row, and then a 4th hole that's offset from them, so producing kind of an L shape, and that those match pretty well with what's called the poker holes on the Shroud of Turin. And again, it's not known exactly when those were made in the shroud. They're before the 16th century fire. And again, they're one of the most striking features on the shroud because again, the image itself is in some ways faint, but if you think of the pictures we often see when something involving the shroud is mentioned or publicized, what sort of makes an impression first? Well, first it's those patches in a lot of cases where those burns from the 16th century fire were made. And then another thing, again, that strikes people isn't the image itself, but these holes in an L shape. And again, we see these holes replicated, not just in the Pray manuscript, but again on pictures by Byzantine artists, and even in the official coins of the Byzantine Empire. So that's another really striking one because beginning in the second half of the 900s, again, so the timeline here is very striking. The empire's coins often had the face of Jesus with a cruciform halo. So that halo that we often see in art to point out this is Jesus, it's got a sort of a cross inscribed in the circle of the halo. After the beginning in the second half of the 900s, that space where the sort of cross is the crossbar of the cross going to either side of the face of Jesus, that space had been blank before, but starting in the second half of the 900s, these 3 mysterious holes, or at least on something as small as a coin, at least dots appear in that space where there was nothing there before. This is all suggestive or worth taking notice of because of one of the peculiarities of Byzantine art in particular. It's governed by these very rigorous rules. The concern in the ancient Byzantine world in making art was with receiving the authoritative models and following them very closely. So innovation was kind of a dirty word in that context. We might. It's such a powerful thing to think of because it's so contrast, I think, with our own experience and with what sort of the guiding ethos for Western art has been for a few hundred years now, which is make it new. It was just the opposite in the ancient Byzantine world. Do not make it new. You better not. And in fact, we have, historians have the text of a 9th century rule book that was sort of the rule book for Byzantine governing officials, sort of the subsidiaries of the empire, sort of regional governors it might have been. And in this rule book, among all the other guidance for rulers and for governors, it lays out the possible penalties artists who violated the principles of the empire's art. And they would have been considered to be in breach of contract then. And this rule book specifies that they could be punished with flogging. They could be whipped for breaking the rules of the empire's art, or they could be deported. So they could be kicked out. Again, if they deviated from the authoritative models. So the existence of and the adherence to some model for the icons of Christ that was believed to be in some ways singularly authoritative. That if such a thing existed and was followed, that's entirely consistent with the Byzantine icon tradition. Again, if artists were working in this tradition that said hew very closely to the authoritative model in every detail, well, then it seems reasonable that they would have reproduced even seemingly insignificant details. They would have thought, well, this is in the authoritative model. This must be adhered to. And so they might have reproduced things like just sort of random holes that were in that model, or the pattern of the cloth that's in that model, or things that later turn out to be stray or incidental marks, where they would have been seen as important. And the Byzantine artists would have, oh, you know what, sister? I do have photos. I do have pictures of some of these things I mentioned. If my screen sharing could be enabled, I could show them. Okay, so let's see here. There we go. So here's some of the slides. Here's play. So here's some of the words. So there's the archway in I think that 11th century Turkish church that has the strange sort of landscape orientation with a face in the middle. That's the Pantocrator in Daphne, I think, that's called severe or sort of harsh looking. There's the 6th century. So again, 5 from the St. Catherine Monastery at Mount Sinai. So again, there's like, it's just look at that eye. Look at how it's. It's sort of easily explained if the artists are reproducing the image of a man who's been struck in the face, for instance, and has swelling. So again, that's a 6th century icon. There is Christ in sort of reigning in glory in Ravenna. Again, we see the face sort of surrounded by this mass of hair, and again, it shares a lot of features with the face on the shroud. There's the Russian cross mentioned earlier, with not only the second cross piece, but it's tilted up, and again, that convention begins to appear after Orthodoxy becomes the official religion of Russia, and those missionaries go out in the 990s. And there's the Byzantine curve. The head is tilted one way, the body is sort of curved in this C shape. Again, resulting from what? Well, perhaps the executioners of the man on the cross pulling that shorter leg down to bring it to the same level as the other. This is the Pray manuscript from the early 1200s. So you look down in the sort of bottom middle, you'll see those 4 holes, and you'll also see. Okay, so I misspoke when I said it was a deposition scene. Look, this is the holy women coming to the tomb with you can see that bottle of ointment in the hand of one of them, coming to the tomb on Sunday morning, and they see just the angel, and him they do not see. But there's 4 holes in that L shape in the cloth there on the bottom, and again the cloth has this staircase pattern on it, which again is something like again it's sort of big and exaggerated. It's the same pattern as the weaving on the Shroud of Turin, that herringbone twill. Oh, and this is worth noting because it's this is a sculpture from 200 BC that's often called the Dying Gaul, and you look at the you can see the wound on the side of the figure there, and that's apparently a wound from a strike that was it was well known that Roman soldiers would do that, because you come up against an opponent who is likely to be holding a sword in the right hand, or a weapon of some kind in the right hand, because of right hand dominance and so forth. So then that opponent would have the shield on the left hand. So the Roman soldiers would have learned this upward strike. If you could get in through your opponent's right-handed side, where the sword is, but not the shield, you make this upward strike to that side. And again, it's very much like, for instance, the wound on the side of the figure in the shroud that we of course often see replicated in icons of Christ. So it's as if even from this early, the results of being attacked by Roman soldiers was known, and what kind of wound would it have produced? That one, that wound right on the side of the dying Gaul. So let's see here. So so that's about it for my part of the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Brother Nickolai. That was a very interesting series of shots, many of whom I certainly wasn't familiar with, and I'm glad to learn a great deal more about it. At this time, we're going to move forward to our next talk, which is by Mark Antonacci. Excuse me. Mark Antonacci obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree from Western Illinois University in 1971, with a major in political science and a minor in history. He graduated with distinction from John Marshall Law School in Chicago in 1977 and practices law in Missouri and Illinois. Antonacci is an author who has studied all aspects of the Shroud of Turin for over 38 years. He wrote a book, The Resurrection of the Shroud, in 2000. It was the most comprehensive book written on the Shroud until his later landmark book entitled Test the Shroud, which was released in 2016. Mark's topic today is the scientific and medical aspects of the Shroud. Okay, Mark, take it away.
I guess I need to share the screen.
John, Father Nickolai, would you transfer the host over to Mark?
Here, I'll do it.
Oh, okay. Sebastian is.
Okay, I've just claimed the host.
Okay.
Now, Mark, I'm going to make you host. All right, Mark, you're host.
We'll be right with you here. I'm just going to start while we're trying to put it up, but shrouds are obviously very long. The Shroud of Turin is 14 feet, 3 inches long. It's 3.5 feet wide. It's very typical of shrouds that were used in ancient times. And if you look at some of the pictures of the scenes of death in the Middle East, you'll still see them throughout. There's a picture in my 2015 book of some of the unfortunate victims of the Syrian gas attacks. And while they're transporting them to a permanent mass burial, you'll see them being transported in shrouds. And look closely just on the news, you'll still see shrouds there. But the Shroud of Turin is different than all of them. Of course, it has 2 full-length images on it. And if you see on the shroud, the top part, that's the outer part of the shroud. But look at the inner part of the shroud, the part that the man is laying on. His back and side is all covered on it. And all this part here is the inner side of the shroud. And then what's underneath this will be the part that draped over his body, the inner side of the shroud. The inner side of the shroud on the frontal and the dorsal side is where these unprecedented images all reside. For centuries, this is what people saw on the shroud. This is a faint, fairly blurred image of a man. I've actually taken one that's a little bit enhanced so you could at least make out the frontal image on the right and the dorsal image on the left. One of the biggest reactions against the shroud's authenticity is that in Europe, it's been deemed a painting since the 1300s. As you can tell, there's just a plethora of images from Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, Edessa, places in Turkey and the Middle East, where the traditional image of Christ is much different, and it has an image of not being made by the hand of man. And there's several more full-length images as well as facial images. But in Europe, it gets this reputation of being a painting. And this is ridiculous. It's based on a memorandum that was sent to the anti-pope at the time, who had jurisdiction in France, the Avignon Pope. And it probably wasn't even sent. And in there, he mentions that a predecessor, 30 years before, held an investigation, and a man confessed to painting the shroud. He doesn't give his name. He doesn't give the method. There's nothing like it in history, but that's what's accepted. And it's accepted for 600 years. 500 years after that, a guy named Secondo Pia, who was also a lawyer, and he was an excellent amateur photographer. Secondo Pia, they were having an exhibition in 1898 of the Shroud in Italy, and it was celebrating a famous holiday, a 50th anniversary of the Constitution that became accepted throughout Italy. And he wanted to take a picture of this, what you're seeing on the screen, so that people could be vaguely aware of the Shroud of Turin and that it has a reputation as Jesus' burial cloth. That's all he wanted to do. He had no idea that when he took a picture and he went into the development room, that this would result. It was stunning. This is the negative of Pia's original picture. And this is unheard of. When Pia saw this, he almost dropped his image. He was expecting the original image to be more blurred than that. He was expecting, hey, Ricardo, I can't go backwards. I'm sorry. Thank you. Pia was expecting, when he developed his image, here's what you get when you take a photo. This is a photo, makes no sense. It's a vague, blurry scene. You can't tell what it is. It's actually a picture of my stepchildren and their cousins in a tree. But that's the negative. When you go to the positive, that's what you see. On a negative, when you take a picture of a person, the light that's reflecting off that person comes toward the camera. The camera, the film, in Pia's case, it's a glass plate. It's enclosed in a dark container, whether it's a small brownie camera or a great big tripod like Pia had in his day. But it goes in there and it forms a negative image. Pia was expecting something like this on a vague cloth itself. And when he saw the positive image, he realized, oh my gosh, the original picture is the negative. And this is the positive. And you go from, on a negative, it goes from faint. When you take the resolved picture of a person that you're taking his picture, it's resolved, we see it, we recognize it. But when it makes a negative, it goes from resolved to vague. It goes from left to right. The man's left is on his right on the negative, and vice versa. The light or dark on the person becomes the opposite on the negative. Pia realized this was the negative and this was the positive. And when people saw that, there's a few scientists who started saying, wait a minute, how in the world could you have painted that? How in the world could you have painted that? Now, photography, it actually starts in the middle of the 19th century, but most people don't know much about it. And a lot of the public just couldn't understand the fairly simple photographic process where it takes the light, it makes a negative, and from the negative, you then take it to another dark chamber, the developing room, and it becomes a positive. This was rejected by most people. A few scientists started investigating it, but by and large, it was rejected. And many scholars, ecclesiastics and non-ecclesiastics, rejected it and went back to the 500-year-old compounded hearsay investigation that was never made, that the shroud was painted and confessed. It wasn't until 1978 when a group of scientists from some of the most impressive institutions in the world thoroughly examined the Shroud of Turin. This was the only time the shroud has ever been comprehensively examined. Now, there's one point I want you to know. when Pia took the photograph, there was an ornate frame around the shroud, and it hung above an altar. There was bunting on the altar, and but look at all the change, the positiveness, the new information that you can see on the positive image. All it's doing is going back to the original subject that it took, the tree, the kids. That's all that happens in the darkroom. All the detail is on the body. When Pia develops the images, the altar doesn't give more details on the negative. The bunting doesn't. The ornate frame around it doesn't. They get vague. But this image stands out. The background doesn't. You don't see nothing on the background. It's just the body image is the positive image, and the body image was the negative image. This tells you something very important that they did not even notice in that day. The source of the radiation that caused this negative image is that body. It wasn't the altar. It wasn't the bunting. It wasn't the frame. It's this. In a photograph, they use light reflecting off the subject, whether it's a tree or whether it's a man or a person. The light reflects into the camera, into that hole, and it reverses it. And then in the developing room, in another dark room, it brings it back to what it was. This tells you something that they didn't even realize at the time, that the shroud is not only a negative image. The source of the radiation that creates this negative image is the cloth. And Pia gets interrupted in his photographic process. Halfway through it, the positive develops. That's because, now Pia immediately knew this. He immediately knew this was a negative image. And many people just didn't understand this. And the overwhelming response was, this was just a fluke. This was just a fluke. And it's very sad. People ignored this. People just wrote it off. In 1898, they never had the ability to put these kinds of pictures in newspapers. There was only a couple of magazines that carried them. They were very poor quality, and they were just a facial image. Most people blew it off, and a stream of people came out saying, no, this is a painting. And there's one other thing that gets people's reaction, and that is there's no mention in the Gospels of an image of Jesus. I'm going to try to go to the medical information because Sister told me that many people here have a medical background. We have physicians and nurses and things of that nature, and they want me to cover it, and I will. But I want to come back to this. This is the first sign that we have that radiation is not only involved in the image, but the source of the radiation is the body, even if they didn't recognize it in 1898. And I'm going to come back to this when we're done with the medical and show you about 30 more features that only radiation can consistently cause. And they all indicate that the source of the radiation has to be that body that was wrapped in the cloth, just like we saw in the original picture right there. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to then think of hypotheses of how radiation from the body could have possibly caused those images. And that's really where the intriguing investigation has been for the last close to 40 years. And I want to come back to this because that's where all the evidence is pointing to. And all I'm trying to do is get people to understand that there is a wealth of scientific testing that could be done on the Shroud of Turin at the molecular and the subatomic levels that would indicate, yes, the images were caused by radiation. The source of the radiation was that body wrapped in that cloth. And you could actually prove whether it is a stupendous form of radiation that wasn't even discovered until the 20th century. And it would have all kinds of ramifications, some of which I'll try to show you, but it could tell you how many the number of these subatomic particles that were released. You would have billions of items of evidence from a drop of blood or from very, very plentiful materials from the shroud that could easily be tested. And I'm trying to get scientists to undertake these kinds of tests on controlled blood, controlled linen, controlled charred material, and various others I hope I have time to tell you about. But you could demonstrate with irrefutable evidence that yes, a radiating event occurred. And yes, this would easily explain the last reason that people are very skeptical of the shroud. And that is it was carbon dated to the Middle Ages in 1988. I'll try to get there as much as I can. It's almost covering the shroud is almost like drinking water out of a fire hose. It's very difficult to cover everything, but I'll do my best. Here's a good example of the negative and the positive image. Let's start from top to bottom on the man. This was among his earliest wounds, if this is Jesus. First of all, just look at the expression on his face and the contours. Your immediate reaction is, this is the photograph of a person. And it is very similar to the photographic process, but it is far more sophisticated than the photographic process. Keep in mind, this isn't being done on film or photographic paper. This is being encoded on linen, which is a hard subject to actually use as a source of encoding. It's not like a canvas or something like that. But you can tell just looking at that face that looks like a human face. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to consider this possibility. Here's the left-right reversal. The blood marks on the man's right were actually on his left. This is what he looked like when he laid in the cloth. The positive image is. But you see a triangular shape wound here, that's blood. You also see the images on the top and middle of his face and of his head. This is on your right here, it's arterial blood, it spurts out from the wound. This is venous blood where it just slowly drips down the face. Possibly the man was wrinkling his eyebrows, which causes it to change directions. The wounds are actually on the scalp. On the back, there's about 20 wounds. On the front, there was about 10. Look at them. They're different rivulets. They're all in different positions, indicating the head was probably in different positions at different times. They all stop along a concave curve, consistent with some type of a crown or circle of wounds. Here too, you find the images. Here's the top of his head, but you find these wounds up near the middle of the head. There's no images on the top of the man's head, the crown, or the bottom of his feet, nor the sides. But this is all consistent with something like a cap that fit over the entire head. It's different from the circlet or wreathlet type imitations that you normally see in Western art. Pathologists, anatomists, physicians, since 1898 really have with Pia's discovery, they could now look at the blood marks on the cloth, and then they could study them on the photographic negative, which from here on out, I'm going to call it what it really is. It's the positive image of the man on the shroud. But they had both to study it, and there's such an anatomical consistency and reactions. I can't tell you 100% that it's a human male, but I can tell you it's at least 95, probably 98% certainty. More tests and experiments would easily resolve it to, I don't know if you ever get it 100%, but you could get it beyond DNA testing, beyond 99.4 or something like that. Let's talk about some of the wounds, some of the reasons people are skeptic about the shroud. Many Christians have said, well, since the wounds were in the man's wrist, it can't be Jesus because there's a lot of small bones in the wrist, and it's true. And you could easily break one, and the Old Testament prophesies that not a bone in the body of the Messiah would be broken. Actually, when a guy named Pierre Barbet started doing experiments with cadavers, and he started putting nails in the locations where they appear to be on the shroud, he found there's a place called the space of Destot, where these small bones here on the right all separate, and they provide a good support for the nail right in the middle, and it would hold the weight of a full person. The only excavated remains of a crucifixion victim are of a man named Yehohanan, and his was discovered in 1968. They are from the 1st century. This man was crucified by the Romans. He has a nail in the wrist as well, and there's scratches between the radius and the ulna. And the archaeologist, the Israeli archaeologist, said this scratch is produced by the compression and the friction and the gliding of an object on a fresh bone. Well, this type of friction is actually consistent with another thing you see on the shroud, and that's streams of blood. This is the negative image. This is what you see with the naked eye, but the blood marks are on differently than the body image. So there you see them very realistically. And the man appears to have been, there's about a 10% difference in angle of the blood marks. And this is consistent with a man who's hanging on a cross. When you hang suspended on a cross, you can't breathe. You can't exhale. You can take air in, but you can't get rid of it. So in order to breathe, you have to pull up on your nailed wrist, and you have to push up with your nailed feet. It's very painful, and it raises the horizontal axis of your arms and your shoulders about 10 degrees. It raises you up, and you can exhale and then go back down to the position, and when you need some more air, you can push yourself and pull yourself up again. This only prolongs the inevitable, but this is very consistent with the streams that you see on the shroud. And yes, while the left hand is covered, the right hand, you can clearly see the nail is in this area of the wrist. Now, look at something else on here. I'll get to the fingers. I'll go to the fingers now. These look like bones. In fact, the bones even go over the, if you will, over the top of the palms and the top of his hand. There are some anatomical differences here, imperfections, if you will, on the body. But some of these can actually be explained by a hypothesis in which The body's not only giving off radiation, but the body's disappearing and the top of the cloth is collapsing by gravity. There may also be a vacuum in there, but I'll keep it straightforward. Just think in terms of gravity. The hands, I don't know if you can see, here you go. The hands were probably like this. If a cloth collapses down over these curved hands, when you hold the fingers out straight, when you hold the cloth out, they'll look long. But all this is showing is probably the cloth curved around the finger, the hands, the fingers on the hands, and encoded them from knuckle to finger. Well, take a cloth measure, the ones in inches from your mother or your grandmother's sewing boxes, measure a curved hand and measure a straight hand. The curved hand will make it appear longer when the cloth is stretched out. Some of the imperfections are actually interesting and indicative of a cloth collapsing. But if you notice, the fingers are long. But what I'm trying to show you is there's bones in there. And the radiation appears to be not only of a low energy, a very low energy, and you'll see this more, but it's from the surface of the body. When a guy's laying on his back, it's just the topmost surfaces. There's bones indicated on the back of the man, his spinal column, but both of these are on the surface of the body. And it appears that it all takes place in less than a second, but only the imaging radiation that's coming from the surface is getting encoded on the body. And that makes sense. If it was coming from the entire body, if this process took more than a brief moment than it did, you'd have nothing but a big blur. Here's the feet. You almost see an imprint of the foot here, the whole foot. Some people think the nail is here in the ball of the foot. Some people think it was perhaps up here on the heel. But the blood's in two different positions. It flows from the ball of the foot down toward the toes, and then it flows probably from the ball of the foot down to the heels. The man's in two positions. When he's on the cross, which is when he dies, the blood is running vertical from the ball of his feet down to his toes. When he's taken and put in burial or in a horizontal position and laid on his back, the blood's going to run from the ball of his feet down to his heels. This part of blood here is one of the few off-image areas of blood. It looks like some type of, perhaps it just, once the foot was there, it got bounced over, I don't know. Most of the blood is on the body, but they think, and this is consistent with some of the artistic tradition that Father John was talking about, the left foot was pivoted over to the right foot and one nail went through about this position, and it too would provide support because the weight of the body starts coming on at this location here on the body, on the frame, and this is more of a picture how Pia's photographic negative would look like. The man's legs are not broken. Here's, you can see the upraised leg on the dorsal side. It looks upraised, the knees bent. This part looks upraised. And on the frontal side, see the knee is raised, and it looks like that leg is still upraised from when it was rotated over and placed on the left foot, on the right foot. The man's legs are not broken. The first century crucifixion victim, Yehohanan, his legs were broken. It wasn't necessary for this man. He too has a post-mortem side wound. You can see the side wound on the positive image. It's the largest amount of blood on the shroud. It oozes down. It's not propelled like a beating heart. This is probably the line where the instrument goes into the man's side. It continues down his side and actually goes all the way across his back. It's interrupted by some clear, watery fluid. They're both, all these fluids are post-mortem. There's no swelling around the skin. Right here, I don't know if you can see that, but there's a clear area. This is serum. This is consistent with a human body would react to a wound. If you put a instrument into between the 5th and 6th rib where it appears to have gone into the man in the shroud, it's going to pierce the right auricle, and it really doesn't matter what type of angle that instrument is. It's going to hit around there. And the right auricle fills with blood upon death. The watery fluid could have come from the pleural spaces or the pericardial fluid. I leave that up to the pathologist to try to figure out. You could actually determine whether there's this type of fluid on the Shroud of Turin if you tested it at the molecular level. I think what's most interesting about the wounds on the shroud is the scourge marks. The man has been whipped or beaten, and you'll see all kinds of they generally run in a pattern of 2 and 3. They're small indentations. They run all over the back, all over the lower back, his buttocks, his thighs, his calves, and they're even up here on his chest. The whip could whip around from the back. You don't see any scourge marks on his hands or his arms. You don't see any on his head. This is very consistent with a man who's beaten from behind, and his hands are either upraised or on a post or something, and all the wounds are on the torso or legs of the man. There's easily over 100 of these. These are very, very interesting. When you take a photograph of the body, and then you use a photographic enlarger and a microscope, and you look at each one of these wounds, which they started doing in the 1930s, and this continued in the 70s, you'll see that in each one there's a slightly indented center and a slightly upraised edge. This is all consistent with what an instrument, see the indented centers there and the upraised edges? This is consistent with a Roman flagrum. They have been excavated. They usually had barbells at the ends of them, or maybe bones. It would rip the flesh, and you would, but you don't see these unless you look on the positive image, and also you don't see them unless you shine ultraviolet lighting on them. And then you can see also the fluorescing serum around the edges. And they've also taken the serum from these edges and tested it chemically. But think if a forger had to encode those, and he couldn't even see any of these details. And there's over 100 on the image. And if you get it wrong on just one, it shows it's inaccurate and it's a forgery. And they're all right, and they couldn't see it for centuries. The same thing with the body image. You couldn't encode all that detail into those earlier negative images that I showed you. Never be able to check your work. Never know if you've gotten it right. And I'll show you that these images are found on not only thousands, but tens of thousands of fibers that exist on the phrase on the outside of a thread. If your arm was a thread, the fibers would be the hairs of your arm. That's where the images are. To think that somebody painted it like this is ridiculous, and I'll get to this in a minute. Think about the wound on the right side. On the cloth, it's on the left side, and that's all they saw for hundreds of years was the reverse. On the left side, I'll have to go back to the original image. The wound on the man is here. This is clearly the man's left side. He wouldn't know until 1898 that this was a negative and the image is really on the right side of the man in the shroud. Here's a good example. You get left-right reversal and up-down reversal, and here it's on the man's right side. How is he going to encode it so that it lines up perfectly on the right side, just a few inches from the right auricle from which blood and watery fluid would come? He only has a 50-50 chance that it's the correct side. How's he going to line it up so perfectly on the left side so that 600 years later, you'll find it on the right side? There's so many things like that. A forger, he wouldn't even know these concepts, let alone encode it. But keep this process in mind. It'll come up again and again and again. But the borders wouldn't be known, and this cloth could only have been so perfectly encoded there if it laid over a man's right side, even though when you held the cloth up, it would show on his left. This is a human body that encoded these images. Okay, you'll see on the on here, you see some abrasions. And the scourge marks are slightly different in here. It's another indication the scourge marks are on there before this. This is consistent with a heavy, rough object being carried by this particular individual. This is consistent with a crossbeam that often executioners had to carry. This is the man's left leg. There's scratches on here. There's dirt on the man's knee. There's dirt on his feet. There's even dirt on the man's nose. All of this is consistent with a man who fell and couldn't break his fall. Now, I'm sure a forger could sprinkle some dirt on the cloth, but it would be hundreds of years before he knew there's such a thing as science who could identify the types of dirt that are in Jerusalem, are in the same rock shelf in which Jesus was buried in from other kinds of dirt. But that could have been forged. But even that, it would take a very intelligent guy to have anticipated. These blood marks, I want you to know, are all over the body. I have very conservatively estimated there's 150 blood marks on this body. But one of the things that there's several things I want to point out about these blood marks. The side wound is a good example. These blood marks line up, but they only line up on the positive image, which is how the man looked when he was laying in the burial. This is another indication that these are not a forgery. This is a real person. The blood marks are completely different than the body image. They seep into the threads, whereas the body image is just on the superficial fibers. The blood seeps into there. Look at this. This is a photomicrograph of wounds. I think they're from the side wound. They're magnified about 200 or 300 times. It very clearly shows the blood marks are still red. Now you can see just looking on the cloth that they're still red. Do you ever cut yourself shaving? I've done it hundreds of times. The blood originally comes off your chin and it's still red. But when it gets exposed to the open air and it comes outside the body, it soon starts turning dark. Blood will start turning dark within minutes, conservatively within hours or days. This blood, even if you accept the notion that the shroud was painted in the 1300s, would still be 650 years old. Blood doesn't stay red that long. One of the tests we want to conduct, and we want to build upon the work of an Italian physician who passed away. His name was Dr. Goldoni. He lived in Italy, and he claims that if you radiate coagulated blood that is sitting on linen, it will interrupt the molecular, structure or something about the composition of the blood itself at the molecular level, so that when this cloth is subsequently exposed to UV light, plain old sunshine, that those blood marks will stay red. And when you shine light on them, they become even redder. I've seen this. I've stood in front of the shroud probably 35 times or more in my life. And it's usually, it has 6 feet of protective glass over, but it's usually just illuminated with a little bit of UV light that gets to the shroud. You can see the blood marks are red, and you have to stand about 15 or 20 feet away from it. You can't get any closer than that for a couple of reasons. One is for safety, but number 2 is you can't see the body images unless you stand about 15 feet away from it. But you can clearly see the blood marks are red. And the documentation and description of those goes back centuries. Something has caused this uniquely to remain red. Now, there's been many artistic explanations tested, but those don't hold up when they're tested. But I want to test this. We want to irradiate some human blood, let it coagulate, and Barbet says all of these wounds on the body coagulated on the skin, on the body. This man actually appears to be, his body appears to be in rigor mortis. Look at the legs here. They're still holding that position with the upraised left leg over the right leg. If rigor mortis had declined, look, the feet are still pointed down from the crucifixion. They're pointed flat. His feet was over his hands like that. His feet are pointed down. For them to maintain such an awkward position is an indication that rigor mortis set in while he was in the crucifixion position. It set in soon after he died, and that it was still maintained at the time of the image forming event. And if you put someone in a cool environment like a cave, and you put him there and he spends the rest of his time there for the next day and a half, it would maintain itself, especially if this guy had went through a rigorous physical exercising. And listen, all the tortures the guy underwent before his crucifixion and his crucifixion, that would easily qualify. Going up the back of the legs, the thighs, the buttocks, the lower back, they're all stiff and rigid. Same thing. For them to maintain that position is a sign of rigor mortis. Even up here, it's still thick on the lower, it's stiff, the lower back and the shoulders. The pectoral muscles are enlarged and drawn in toward the chest. He's got, his hands have intentionally been placed over the front of him. You would have had to get the man inside the wound, you would have had to massage the shoulders of the man to get him inside and to place them where they did. But notice in the process, the left side is about 5 degrees higher than the right side. This could be due to the crucifixion or it could be just due to the way they massaged his shoulders there. The head would have rotated, it's slightly turned to the right, unless it's in rigor mortis or something is blocking it, it would have rotated to the head. All the blood marks are not only consistent with the wounds from a body, but all the body from the, I forgot to show you one other thing about the wrist. There's something funny here. There's no thumbs. The thumbs are missing. Have you ever seen Christ portrayed without thumbs? If a forger's doing this, why would he do it like this? You can look through easily the most popular subject in all of history, at least Western art, has certainly been the crucifixion. And thousands of these statues and carvings and paintings still survive today. And I've been fortunate enough to look through just every one I could get my hands on, and they're well into the hundreds. People actually collect these, and you can just go to somebody who's got great samples. And you'll see a couple, I mean less than a half dozen, where the wound might be arguably in the wrist. Usually, sometimes it's near the heel area of the hand, but you'll never see a picture where there's a wound in the wrist and the thumb's missing. If you hit the space of death spot and you nail it in farther, and they would have had to nail it in farther because they're nailing into cross beams, and the nails they used for crucifixions were big spikes. They were 7 or 8 inches long. So you would have had to give it several whacks. And if you start giving it more whacks, that nail's got to go through it to hit the crossbeam, but then it's going to hit the median nerve, and it's going to cause the thumbs to contract into the palms. When you set the hands over, the thumbs are missing. An artist would not have painted this. I think it can certainly be argued it's another unique sign of not only the human anatomy there, but that this is the authentic thing. And that's what happened. An artist wouldn't add that if he's trying to say this is a picture of Christ. The blood marks, they come from the wounds, they bleed down on the body, and they look on the body. They look in the cloth exactly as they would have looked on the body. When I told you that when you shine the scourge marks with ultraviolet lighting, it's serum that's been identified from the UV lighting and identified chemically when they take them from the borders and test them. There's serum around all these scourge marks with the indented centers, the upraised edges, and that's the majority of the features. That whole back is all scourge marks. That's the most predominant wound on the body. But all the other images, most of those have scourge marks around them as well. Ricardo? Lost my viewing. I've lost my image. I don't know if this getting on had anything to do with it, but I've lost.
Mark, I'm still seeing the image exactly of the shroud.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I am too now. For a minute there, I lost it. But these blood marks not only have serum around there, these blood marks have human hemoglobin, human albumin, human whole blood serum, and human immunoglobulins, as well as human DNA, have all been found on the Shroud of Turin. I'm going to go on and talk about the blood marks a little bit more. They're not only coagulated, but they all coagulate on the body. Ricardo, I can't advance my pictures. I don't know if they're advancing on yours, Tom, but Ricardo? Yeah.
No, I'm still just looking at the main shroud picture.
Yeah, I'm trying to advance it from there. Okay.
There you go. Oops.
These blood marks not only are in beyond the topmost fibers and threads, they can be seen on the back side. The blood marks are embedded in the cloth, and this is the inner side of the shroud. This is the outer side of the shroud, and they look pretty similar. The shroud marks are embedded within the thickness of the linen cloth. They're all like that. This is the back of the head. This is a side wound. This is the blood and watery fluid that goes around the small of the back on the inner side. This is it on the outer side. Now keep in mind, lay on a hardwood floor and test this. But the small of the back would not be in contact with the cloth. If you lay on a hardwood floor, the mass of your body is going to be on the center of your shoulders and on your buttocks. It's not going to be on the small of your back or your lower back. The blood marks still transferred onto the shroud. Now that's the same thing with the body image too, and I'll try to tell you about it. Most of the scourge marks transfer onto the back. This just shows how well bleeding and blood marks were understood in the 1350s. This is from a medical journal. Most of the scourge marks are transferred. They would not have been in contact with the body, and they would have been on the top here. You see them still transferred on the top of the body. The man's arms are folded over his groin. If you lay on a floor and you put your hands in that position over the top of you, there's not going to be any contact on this top of the shoulder here. All this stuff gets transferred onto the cloth. All the scourge marks on the upraised legs do as well. And it wouldn't have been in contact with the cloth, and you see it on the center too. They still get transferred. This process is a very unique process. This is what the fibers look like. This is the yellowish color that you see, and it's to be contrasted with the whiter colors. And here's the yellow colors. It's a light brown sepia color. The colors are only on the topmost superficial fibers. And they're all the same uniform color. And this is just the tip of the nose. Think how many thousands, it's probably tens of thousands of superficially, uniformly colored fibers all over the body image. that are encoded like that. Try to think of somebody painting that. It's almost ridiculous. And of course, that's the first thing Stirp says. It's not painted. This is a very realistic view of what the shroud looks like with the naked eye. You have to stand within 10 or 15 feet to distinguish between the naturally yellow background and the body image background. If you were a painter, whenever you went in there to get up close and encode these microscopically, you'd lose your vision. You couldn't tell where you were on the facial image, on the body image. You'd have to have a focal microscope. They wouldn't be invented for centuries. This mark here, it is consistent with something to give it such a delicate touch. It's low energy radiation. These fibers, when you take one and if you cut it in half, it's still white on the middle. Its yellow coloring resides only on the outer rims. It's 0.4 microns. It barely goes into the outer surface of a fiber. And when you cut it, it's still white on the inside. They don't stick or mat together. They're actually individually encoded. You can't paint any of that, but one feature that would cover is very low sensitive radiation. The image consists of what's called oxidized dehydrated cellulose. And I'll give you an example of this. We used to use, my friends and I, 35 years ago, we would do some amateur experimentation. And we would take UV light, we'd shine it on a piece of linen, a square piece of linen. And it never mattered how long we shined the linen on with UV radiation. You couldn't see anything when you turned the light off. Then we tried something else. We shined it with a circle of light onto a square piece of cloth. When you couldn't see anything, we put it in an oven at a low temperature for a couple of hours. Then when we took it out, it's a rough way of artificially aging. When we took it out, the entire cloth had turned light brown, like this. But where you saw the image, it was darker. That's an analogy to what you have on the shroud. Radiation can cause that, but it only appears and shows up over time. If the shroud was irradiated with radiation, it could leave an image like this, but you would not see it. And several scientists have calculated it. You wouldn't see it for a couple of decades. That's actually consistent with Father John's artistic history. There's no mention of an image on Jesus' burial shroud. Everyone agrees he was buried in a shroud. That was one of the things that perplexed me, was there's no image mentioned in the shroud. There would have been no image at the time, and of course, Jewish burial customs would have required that anything that touched a dead body or was wrapped around a dead body, they got rid of it. You destroyed it. It was contaminated. You would not have kept it around. Somebody had to keep it, and later, maybe when it was over in Turkey or Edessa or Byzantium, they noticed this thing's got an image. Let's save it. And it was hidden away. But if somebody has a method for creating an image on a shroud that results in an image immediately, like a painting or other naturalistic or artistic methods, it couldn't have been Jesus's burial cloth, because if there was an image on the shroud that was visible, you would have seen it. But not even this negative image would have been visible for at least a couple of decades. Then it starts getting more interesting. Vignon, back at the turn of the century, after Barbet's photographs of 1898, he starts studying the shroud from 1900 to 1902 is when he begins, and he carries it on till his death in 1943. He first notices, and you can see this on both the negative image on the left and the positive image on the right, that let's start with the negative image. The darkest parts of the body image, or on the light dark reversed positive, which is how the man really looked, on him it'd be the lightest parts of his body. They correspond with the parts of the cloth that would have been touching the body. They were the parts that was closest to the body. Now, the parts that were farthest away from the body are the least encoded, but some of them are still encoded. If you go more than 4 inches away from where the cloth was draped over the body, you won't get a body image. But this shows a number of things. There's a correspondence between the dark and lightness on the cloth and the original distance that the cloth was when it was draped over the body. It also indicates that the encoding process has to go through space in some manner. Radiation can accomplish those things. Stirp found a computer that would show relief based upon distance if the intensity of the image was based upon the distance that the cloth or whatever your material, film or whatever it is from the source of the light. When you put a shroud image into a computer imaging device in which the relief is based upon the distance that the encoded material was from the structure being imaged, it gives you a 3-dimensional image on a 2-dimensional surface, and it's not just on the face, it's on the entire body. Stirp went to great lengths to take volunteers. They used to get Air Force cadets who are as similar to the height and weight and physical structures of the man in the shroud on the positive image as possible. And they would measure all the distances on the shroud and their distances with the cloth draped over the body. And it was really a studied effort that went on for quite a while by an entire group. And if you took a normal picture and you put it into this computer imaging device, it's going to be distorted. That's because the features, the color of the skin, the shirt color, the hair, the eyebrows, the color of the eyes, their intensity or coloration has nothing to do with their distance from the camera. So when you put a photograph in here, it's going to be distorted. But on the shroud, the cheeks, even the ones where it's bruised and swelling, shows up more relief. You find this throughout the frontal image on the shroud. Now you see it better on the face because there's a greater variety of relief on a face in a shorter distance than on a body. But this was one of the astounding things they saw, and this they discovered before they went over in 1978. This made the collection of Stirp scientists, it doubled overnight with this kind understanding. It's really a hard thing to explain, but the reason that the shroud has different intensity, it's not because the fibers are encoded at a greater depth like a painter would do. There's a greater number of colored fibers laterally across an area than in depth. Whoever heard of encoding three-dimensionality in this way? But that's actually what you have. Nobody's going to be able to see that when he's trying to encoding that. He's not going to be able to wait 600 years till computer imaging devices come together, and he can do that. And he can check his work. Besides, no one has done that to this day. This shows you if there's any two-dimensional directionality to the shroud. I'll try to keep it less scientific, but this is a part of the body image. And the round circle shows there's nothing to, it's just randomly oriented. You'll see a cross in the middle. That's simply the warp and the weft of the vertical and the horizontal weave. There's no two-dimensional directionality to the shroud. The shroud, how did it get encoded? How did the imaging get encoded? There's only one dimension left in our known world of space, and that's the third dimension of height. The shroud's body image, they found, was encoded in a straight up or straight down direction from the cloth to the body. And the leading image formation hypothesis says the cloth collapses. Other imaging formation hypothesis thinks that the radiation is collimated, something like a laser light. But that's what they found. It's as if every pore or hair in the body was giving off radiation like a micro miniature laser. Tell me something other than radiation that can encode a feature like that. Certainly a painter can't do it. And think about just the last two things we talked about. On the shroud image is encoded a three-dimensional correlation between the cloth and the body. And that's all found on the body image. And there's also a correlation with the vertical directionality of the encoding process. And that's encoded on the image, on the cloth. But both of these are encoded in direct correlation with the body. If it's encoded on the cloth, the source of this information can only be the body. There's only two factors in that equation, and you're looking at the material on the body. This is another indicator that radiation could explain all the unique features on the shroud, and that the source of the radiation was the body. Here's another quick example. See the blood marks on the shroud? On the hands, on that. It's not a good image, but this is, they lit the image from the back and took the photograph from the front. If the shroud was painted, you'd see the paint like the blood marks. You don't see that. It's another indication that the shroud's not painted. There was some natural experiments done on the shroud. There's a lot of light scorches on the shroud. Here's some darts. This is a picture of the shroud from 2002 with the patches gone. There's a series of dark scorches and light scorches all the way across the shroud. This is the full length of it here. The light scorches are very similar to the shroud's body images. They're encoded with a low intensity. You can see through them, light passes through them. They have a corroded appearance. They have a lower tensile strength. These are all things you see on the shroud's body images. These are all consistent with low energy radiation. STURP scientists would produce superficial scorches on linen, and they would have controlled heating and artificial aging, and they can produce light, superficial images that reflect UV lighting, the same as the body image, through controlled light forms of radiation. These are all consistent with some type of low energy mechanism accounting for the features on the shroud. The way they reflect and absorb radiation is similar to the shroud's body images. If you take some high forms of technology, if they used modern, one guy encoded particle radiation on the cloth and found something very interesting. That body image material can't be eliminated with all types of acids and bases and oxidants and reductants. It doesn't disappear. There's one they finally found called thymol, which took it off immediately. And a French scientist who's also a priest, Father Ronaldo. But when you encoded it with particles, it immediately came off with his as well. None of them are in and of themselves definitive. But if you tested the cloth at the molecular and atomic level, you could prove this very easily, that the body images, you could test such things as, in the old days when, before hyperspectral imaging and multispectral imaging, if any scientists are listening, I apologize for the simplicity of it, but you could only see things that are in the visible spectrum. But the infrared and the ultraviolet can now be seen at the same time with the visible spectrum. You could scan the entire shroud completely undestructively and just scan everything about it, the water stains, the scorch marks, the burn holes, the full-length body images, the 150 or more blood marks, the serum stains. In 6 hours, you could examine the entire thing. It could confirm unmistakably if there's any materials or particles that could have directly or indirectly caused the body images on the shroud. You could irradiate control linen with all forms of radiation that you could think of. And you could even use high energy radiation if just as a control if you want to. But you could make them all low energy forms of radiation. And yes, you could include things like particle radiation. You can irradiate linen with protons. You could irradiate linen with neutrons. You could, I don't know if they can do it with electrons or not, but I think you could get some materials that have been struck by lightning. Perhaps that would help. But at any rate, you could even compare things like the oxidized dehydrated cellulose. There's the yellow color that you see on the shroud. let me give you an idea why I think it's only something very faint and delicate. The yellow body images that you see on the shroud, the reason we see them is they've not only aged and oxidized and dehydrated and developed over time, something very refined hit the very outer shell, if you will, and that's too thick, but just the outer surfaces, the outer layers of the encoded fibers. The flax plant from which the linen is woven, the inner fibers of the flax plant, they're composed of cellulose, and cellulose is composed of single bonded carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Picture kids holding hands in a circle. On each side of the kid is a single bond. On each side of the molecule is a single bond. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, all in different single bonded chains. Something very delicately has just on the outer surfaces broken up those single bonded molecules, and oxygen and hydrogen, given a chance on their own, will double bond with themselves or each other. Those double bonded molecules of oxygen and hydrogen reflect yellow in the visible spectrum. I'd like to see a painter do that. I really would. But I think I've talked to people who are familiar with molecular microscopy, and they think they can not only identify the oxidized, dehydrated cellulose, but they could identify what's called the double bonded oxygen and hydrogen atoms. They think, I think the name of that is conjugated carbonyls. And you could compare them with control samples, but you're going to get some really specific information. There's going to be so much information that you could derive from the shroud. It would take 6 hours just to to scan it, but it would take years and years for microscopists to control and sort all that information. There would be so much more information that you could acquire from this completely non-destructive act that regardless of what the result is, you're going to learn something about this cloth. I think there's a great myth throughout the world that the shroud is some type of forgery. I don't think the shroud was any type of forgery. I don't think it was any type of natural occurrence. For this to occur naturally is a greater miracle than if some type of miraculous radiating event happened to the body, because a miraculous event consistent with the resurrection is mentioned in the most attested and widely circulated documents of ancient history and modern history. You've got an event, and you know when and where it is, and I can't begin to go into all the evidence that describes that the Romans did the execution and they used the instruments, and this happened in Jerusalem. There's a lot more evidence in this, but this happens under all the same circumstances as Jesus. If you tested the shroud, and this is, I don't even know where my time is. How much time do I have left, Tom?
Mark, I think you have about 5 minutes of the hour and a half that you began with.
Well, I would love to come back through ITEST sponsorship or on my own and tell you about testing the shroud at the molecular and the atomic levels. If you tested the shroud at the atomic level, you could prove that the carbon dating was incorrect and that there's an extraneous effect on the cloth, and it's due to radiation from that body. you could not only prove this, without a doubt, you could prove it with billions of items of radioactive atoms. I'm just beginning to touch the depth of the subject, but there would be billions of radioactive atoms in a drop of blood, and there's conservatively 150 or more blood marks on that body. There's 14 feet of cloth on that, and there's a side strip that goes 13 feet down with original threads. You'd have 13 feet of probably original threads. You could test a loop or two from 13 feet of loops. There's charred material kept in 42 vials in Turin. All you need is a couple of parts of ashes is to tell whether neutrons irradiated that cloth. You could tell easily, you would get a range of dates on that cloth that are going to vary thousands of years, whether you're doing the linen or whether you're doing the blood marks. You could get blood marks that would conventionally date 50 to 100,000 years in the future. Now, the blood wasn't carbon dated on the shroud. But if you took you could prove irrefutably not only that it was irradiated with neutrons, but how many neutrons each part of the cloth received, and that the source of these neutrons can only be the dead body that was wrapped in the cloth. And you would not only know the number of carbon-14 atoms that were added to the cloth by this neutron radiating event, you would know its real age of that sample, why it dated why it did, and not only the source, but you could do these same events on 3 of the same types of materials, the watery fluid from the internal cavity of a man's shroud, the blood, and the linen from the sudarium. If the tomb of Christ is where Jesus was buried, the last information I have is they think there is part of the original structure of the limestone tomb there, despite attempts to destroy this 1,000 years ago. They think one of the side walls is still there. Well, if it is, you would need just a tiny, seriously, I'm talking about something about the size of a pebble, and you'd be talking about a slab that's probably the size of a window or a door. You're not wasting material. In fact, you're getting a great amount of benefit from this tiny amount of material. I'm talking about less material than the excess linen they took in 1988. I'm talking about a very, very tiny amount. But I think this will sound silly, but this is completely consistent with the Gospels. But those body images are left with could be left with tiny particles from that body, energy from that body, the tiniest amount. And all the parts of the body that you see, or even the blood, all regenerate. Hair, skin, bones, blood. Some people have a theological objection that this couldn't happen to Jesus. This would be very consistent if Jesus left his body and blood on the cloth. This would be very consistent with Christian theology. Some people very, very much object to that they might find this. Well, this would be wonderful if you found this. These things could have easily regenerated naturally in Jesus if that's part of the hang-up, or it could have been part of the resurrection. But 6 pints of blood are not on the shroud, but there's plenty of blood on the shroud that you could test. And I'm talking about the tiniest amount. Blood is very chemically rich, and it would show these kinds of things better than anything else, even better than body image material. So would watery fluid. And there's a lot of watery fluid on the shroud, on the sudarium, and there's a lot of limestone in the tomb of Christ. We have far more to gain than to lose. Most people in the world, because of the things we talked about, because of the history of the shroud's reputation in Western Europe, and the shroud's not being a body image not being mentioned in the Gospels and the carbon date, they don't think the shroud is real anyway. Or they'll just think it might be, but it's really not something that means a lot. I was an agnostic when I came across the shroud. There is a lot of evidence. Now, if the shroud turns out not to be Jesus's, I'm going to stay being a Christian. But there's a lot of evidence that I think people could see objectively that lines up perfectly with the Gospels. And they realize, gee, this body gave off particle radiation. That's impossible in any age. And you'd have billions of items. I'm understating the case. All over the cloth, there would be about, a trillion's not even the amount. Probably what's a quadrillion is all over the cloth. But I'm just taking tiny little bits of samples which show you there's billions in every little sample. You could take samples from the side scene, the off image, the body image, the blood, and there's off image blood if you want to use that, or on image. All but 2 of the blood marks are all on image. You could take even some of the limestone and the pollen. The chart material would tell you all these things I mentioned. You could, but I'd like to go into this in great detail with you and show you this is very, very well-known science. These radioactive atoms are created at known rates and disappear at known rates. We could easily do control testing and radiate them in amounts that there's some really sophisticated technology that a guy named Robert Rucker has done. He's a nuclear engineer in Washington, and I've worked with him for about a half a dozen years now. And he can come pretty close with the estimated amounts of radiation coming out from every person, every location on that cloth. I would like to talk about this at a time in more detail, and another hour and a half or something like that. But I hope I've given you an idea that this held a real human being, and this has been known by scientists really since the turn of the 20th century. But you could just positively prove that in every way. People try to say, well, some of the, and this happens, some of the techniques that determine this was human blood and human serum were done 40 years ago, and there's more refined tests now and more specific. Well, of course, that's going to happen. And I'm not against doing more updated testing, but I'm telling you that is a real human being, and it's real human blood, and it coagulated on that body and somehow got transferred. If you're interested, we can go into the whole process of how we think radiation is involved in the body images and the blood marks. But I did want to let you know that is a real human being, and you can only cover so much in an hour and a half, but I would love to talk with you more. And Tom, if you know of some scientists that would be interested in supplementing our work that our foundation is sponsoring, I would just love it. Would love to work with iTest in any way that you would love. I appreciate the time, and I'd love to talk to you more.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark. It's been a very informative and interesting presentation with a lot of careful detail. We now have an opportunity for our audience to participate by asking questions. I know that several have come in through the chat room, and I'd like to turn over the leadership now to Sheila Roth, who will handle those questions and interact with our viewers. Sheila, it's over to you.
Yes. Okay, great. We have several questions about the carbon dating. So let's entertain one that I have here from Tom, which kind of summarizes some of the questions that are in the chat room. Tom says, during the 1980s, there were many scientific tests done on the shroud, which generally came out convincing until the carbon dating test of 1988, which gave a date of origin only about 1,000 years ago. That discouraged a lot of scientists from making any further studies. How will the new test that you propose overcome the objection caused by the carbon dating test?
If neutrons radiated any type of object with any type of elements or chemicals in it, such as oxygen, which all the materials I described would have, it would create new carbon-14 atoms in the materials. All the materials on the 14 feet length and 3.5 feet width, including the linen, the blood, the watery fluid, the limestone, the pollens, the charred material, the sewing threads. There's 7 different materials on the shroud. They would all have additional carbon-14 atoms in there. Neutrons would also create additional radioactive atoms that would still be on the cloth like carbon-14 atoms, and they're called calcium-41 and chlorine-36. You could take any sample and you could measure the calcium or the chlorine, and you'd know how many neutrons hit that cloth. That would then tell you how many additional carbon-14 atoms were added to the cloth. The carbon date, I mean, all the carbon dating scientists and anybody who's familiar with nuclear research that's really gone on almost 100 years now, knows one of the things that discovered was neutrons create radioactive atoms. That's what carbon-14 is, and that's what calcium-41 and chlorine-36 is. If you irradiate any object with neutrons, you're going to make its carbon date look younger. There's a lot of theories about the radiocarbon date, but only neutrons can account for a 1,200-year difference in age. I'll try to explain this. Carbon-14 is about 1 in a million of the total carbon content. If you took a sponge and you poured modern coffee into the sponge and you so saturated the sponge that there was nothing left of the sponge, it was just coffee somehow, it still couldn't date into the future because you've got all the carbon-14 and all the carbon-12 that comes with it. The ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 is going to show you it's modern. The shroud would all date to the future. You're just adding radioactive carbon-14 or other radioactive atoms. You're not adding the other million carbon atoms with it. You're just adding the radioactive atoms. Your numerator's going up, but your denominator's staying the same. I'm getting too complicated here, but only neutrons could explain the 1,200-year difference. I think that the blood marks would date 50 to $100,000 years into the future, because a conventional carbon date just counts the carbon-14 atoms and compares them to carbon-12. They don't pre-treat and eliminate something caused by radiation. The new carbon-14 atoms are created within the nuclei of the atoms that are contained in a chain of molecules. You can't eliminate those with pre-treatment cleaning, but you can prove that they're there. A conventional carbon-14 date assumes they've eliminated all the contamination and dating the original carbon-14 that's left from when the plant or organism was no longer alive. And it's generally correct. It's a valid technique, but it doesn't test for neutrons. And it's a lot more, there was science to this, which the carbon dating labs just ignored. They just dismissed the possibility that it could have been irradiated with neutrons. And they admit it. They thought of it. But there was some inconsistencies with the data that they got, and they just ignored it. And I'd be happy to talk about that at length. But only neutrons could explain a 1,200-year difference. Typical contamination, it would have to account for about 2/3 or 3/4 of the weight of the sample, which you could tell by the naked eye if that was the case. I think only neutrons can explain it. All these other methods have been tested and found to be wanting.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Another thread of questions that I'm seeing. Mona Bollinger asked, is the face cloth discussed in the Bible that was separate from the other linens, the shroud, or is it a separate cloth that was laid over the face of Jesus? And then another question tied to that was, is there a similarity in Veronica's veil and the head wrapping?
Good question. The napkin that is rolled in its own place, that's mentioned in chapter 20, verse 7 of John, could be the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is in Spain. That would have been removed from his face. If that was put on Jesus, that would have been removed before the images were encoded and before he was buried. It would have been a temporary thing that was placed over the face and then removed and folded on its own. It might be that the Sudarium. Veronica's veil is on the face of Jesus, you see a chin band. That would not have been the Sudarium of Oviedo, but something might have been over that face to keep the mouth shut. And you see the gap around the face. But that would not be the Sudarium. I don't know. But if you tested the Sudarium along with the shroud, the Sudarium may also have been in the cave with the shroud. But the validity of the shroud would be independent of the validity of the Sudarium. And the same for the testing of any samples from the tomb of Christ. I hope that's not too complicated.
No, that's good. How about Father Nickolai? Do you have some input on that?
I don't know a lot about it, but the relic in Spain called the Sudarium. I believe its history is documented a little farther back. I think it's at least known to have existed in there since about 800. And it's it doesn't have an image, but it does have blood marks on it. And some of the studies have indicated that there are at least points of contact between the blood on that item, the Sudarium, and some of the marks on the shroud. So people have done some studies like trying to reconstruct, well, how would this cloth have gone around a head? And if it was, it looks like, it was in contact with wounds here, 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 and here. And they don't seem to be contradictory anyway. I believe it's also the same blood type. But again, so I think it's documented pretty much a good deal farther back, I think to around 800. No image, but blood marks that at least plausibly align with some things on the shroud itself.
Okay, thank you. Another question. This is from Tom Sheehan. Many consecutive popes for the last several centuries have declined to assure the faithful of the authenticity of the shroud, yet none have banned devotion to it. What are their reasons for being so doubtful? Father, you want to handle that one?
Sure, I'll go first anyway. I think one thing that's important to make clear, and I realized later I should have begun with this, was that the authenticity of the shroud itself isn't directly a matter of faith. It's not strictly part of what we call the deposit of faith. So it occupies a place more like things like, for instance, some of the special revelations, something like Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Fatima. Those are certainly well respected, and that's another kind of thing that the last several popes have shown a lot of respect and reverence for those messages, for devotions connected to them, and of course the feasts related to those revelations have come into the Church's calendar, so that we have a memorial of Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Guadalupe, things like that. But they don't occupy quite the same place that the absolute sort of kernel truths of the faith, Scripture and capital T tradition would be in. So that I don't want to mind read popes too much, but those kinds of things are usually often promoted by sort of magisterial authority, to the extent that they will assist the devotion and zeal of the faithful, but they're not a sort of a thing that one's required to give the same kind of assent to as, say, the resurrection itself, or the incarnation or the Trinity, those sorts of things. A shroud, or in fact any relic, occupies the place like the place of any sacramental, of any holy image. It's found by the competent authority not to do anything contrary to the faith, but to be a possible aid to it. So that this image, for instance, is offered for us to look upon and meditate, and it's meant, of course, to draw us into the Lord's passion, to be a kind of concrete thing, because we're embodied souls, we're spirit and flesh, so we need concrete things to sort of fix our attention upon, and to ponder and to look at, and hopefully that process assists our faith, but it's not strictly speaking an absolutely necessary part of it.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Mark, do you have something to add to that?
If Christ left his body and blood on his burial cloth with all of these amazing properties, we should look at it. We've got everything to gain and nothing to lose. It doesn't affect the tenets of Christianity. They're all based on the Gospels. But if these findings confirmed every element of the passion, crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection, boy, that's something everybody needs to know about. We are all going to die. And these are the events, the very events that can give us an undeserved life after death. And if it can be demonstrated, that would be wonderful. Well, I can't think of an adjective. That's that would not be an understatement. Well, why not? Why not look on it? The evidence is pointing that way, and the evidence is actually overwhelming from what I can see. If you had hundreds or thousands of items of evidence indicating one thing and one indicating not, you wouldn't just go on the one and throw everything else out. But that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. But you could test this. Now, and when I talk about testing the shroud, for radiation, that's just one of the things. We can still test for every artistic and naturalistic method you can come up with. I'm not against that one bit. There's a popular invisible reweave theory going on that explains the shroud's carbon dating to the Middle Ages. I think that's kind of silly. But let's test it. Maybe it really is. Maybe I'm the one that's silly. But let's test it and see. We're just, in 1978, the shroud was only examined one time. And think of all the thousands of items of evidence we've acquired, and we've only comprehensively examined it one time. Why not test it again? I can't think the thing we have to lose, but boy, we have a lot to gain.
Agreed. Thank you. Yes, there's a lot to gain from that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If any scientists are listening and want to bring the science up so that it can be demonstrated on control materials, then and only then would I want to ask the popes to consider testing this from the shroud. I don't want them to leap. I don't want to leap to the shroud right now. I want to demonstrate and perfect this testing on control samples, all the control samples. It's not fair to anybody to do it any other way, and I wouldn't dream of it. But it can be developed and demonstrated on control samples.
Sure. Keeping up with some testing and some evidence, Tom Sheehan also had another question. He says, supposedly pollen was found on the shroud that could only come from plants that were typical of Jerusalem. Pollen is pretty small and pretty widespread. Could such a measurement be that precise?
It's debatable. Dr. Fry has done the main testing of these samples, and a priest named Werner Balst has done most of the analysis of them. Evanon Deneen and another Israeli pollen expert also got to look at these samples, and many people think that, like Tom asked, can you be that precise? Many of the samples Fry had to find himself with some original research. There wasn't all the data on Middle Eastern pollens as there are now, but he kind of began the pioneering study in that area. I don't know. I think it needs more testing. The only way, one of the ways, that possibility is that if they say a vast majority of them came from Israel, and if that's so, it could only be explained by one thing, I think, and that would be in ancient times when linen was made, they would cut the flax plant and soak it in water. It's called a retting process, and they would take it in water. They would take it out, they'd beat it on a rock and set it in the field, and then they'd let it dry, and then they'd put it back in water, and then they'd take it out and comb it. It was a whole process. But when you set it in the water, pollen's going to fall in the water, and it's going to fall in the field. So if you keep doing that process, it might have picked up all these microscopic pollen into the stalks of the linen that they're going to make the weave out of. And that could have possibly explained why such a large majority of it occurred there. This pollen material, these pollens that were on sticky tape, they've been on sticky tape now since the 70s, and it's hard to examine them. One of the benefits of examining the shroud, taking the backing cloth off and looking at it on both sides, you keep in mind the outer side would have laid on the limestone. It would pick up a lot more dirt and limestone and that kind of stuff, and perhaps pollen. And trying to shut the darn phone off. Pick it up. And possibly through the retting process, it might explain it. Some of the limestone, things like that, you could get it out. You don't have to have the sticky tape that prevents you from seeing it. You could rotate the sample and everything like that. Plus, examine it right there in situ in the cloth, and maybe get a better definition of what kind of pollen this is and where it's at. And the photos, at any rate, and the feedback will give a much better identification than in the old days when they had to use just the pollen that they saw on a sticky tape and compare it to a drawing or a picture in a book.
Okay, great. Early on during Father Nickolai's talk, Russ Briel asked a question. Eusebius doesn't mention an image that comes later in the 5th century. Why do you think there is no mention of it in his writings? Also, other historians believe it traveled through Antioch and arrived in Edessa in 544. Why do you prefer the Edessa version?
Hey, Russ, good. There's different versions, and no one knows at this point which is true. The image of Christ, the traditional image of Christ, starts in the 6th century, and that image could have went from Jerusalem to Antioch or to Edessa or both. We really don't know, and I don't have a preference one way or the other, and I'll leave that up to Father Nickolai and the rest of them to feed in the details.
I would say I don't know that I have a especially strong preference necessarily for Edessa. I'm honestly not aware of the Antioch theory, and this is, I think, if to be honest, this is one of the places where it's difficult to sort of reconstruct that itinerary of the item if it's the same thing, because it does get sort of kind of garbled, and there are these different versions of stories, and there is, most of the sources I read said, there is some legendary material mixed up in it. I think it's at least suggestive, though. That's what always sort of delighted me once I started looking into the history. There are all these hints, these sort of tantalizing mentions that might all be about the same thing or might not. I think one of my sources, one of the authors I read, pointed out that what happens throughout history with legends that arise about something, it's not so often the case that someone says, let me fake up something and also fake up the story that goes with it. But a lot of times a legend arises to explain the presence of something that already exists. So if the actual history of what happened between Jesus and Jude Thaddeus Addai and Abgar, or possibly a later Abgar, if that all got garbled or isn't, we can't really understand what exactly happened. I think the more important thing is that story, or those various stories, account for the existence of something that seems to have been there. That's the best I can say. Honestly, not knowing a lot about the involvement of Antioch or or even directly myself, what Eusebius said.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from Neil Veneman. He said, what do you think St. John, quote, saw and believed, unquote? Is there evidence that John saw the face of Jesus imprinted on the headcloth as the rest of his body was imprinted on the shroud?
There's no image on the body image or face image on the Sudarium.
Okay.
That would have been set off to the side, but only the part of the shroud that wrapped over the body would have a body image. I think he sees the cloth collapsed onto, and I don't think anyone sees an image on the shroud or the Jesus' burial shroud, because there was none at the time, and if there was one, they would have mentioned it.
One of the things worth keeping in mind about that verse is what follows immediately after it, which says they did not. It's either translated they did not know or did not understand that he had to rise from the dead. So when I wanted to know more about that verse, and I looked at it again recently, I went to the Fathers, of course, which is a good place to start. And people like I think St. Augustine at least, and possibly others say. And this might be disappointing, but Augustine says, and it is an ambiguous phrase, but Augustine says he believed what the woman had told him. So Augustine thinks when it says he believed, that means he believed what he had just heard, which is they've taken away the Lord and we don't know where he is. And I don't know much about the subsequent scriptural studies that might have figured out exactly what the meaning of believed in that case meant. But Augustine and at least some of the other early authorities say, because of that following line, they didn't know he had to rise from the dead. It just means he accepted the testimony of the woman he'd encountered right outside the tomb, or the woman who came and told them, and then they ran to see it. That's another possibility anyway for that phrase.
Sure.
Magdalene saw him first.
Okay, we have a question from Paul Segura. He says, I've heard that the 1978 tests were from a sample from the patches from the fire repair, not the shroud itself. He says, what are the leading theories about the 4 holes?
He's referring to some, there's some poker holes on the shroud that Father Nickolai mentioned, the Hungarian Pray manuscript. They're kind of in a shape of a 7. See if I can, I guess my images are gone, but on my screen they're still here.
I can, hang on, I can transfer host over to you. Hang on. Okay, Mark, now you can share your screen.
Okay. There's some holes here and here. You might have some here. We don't know if they're all connected or not, but they think one of the, in ancient times that, but this pattern here is visible on the Hungarian Pray manuscript, among other similarities. The thumbs are missing on the Hungarian Pray manuscript. He's in the same type of posture. And it looks like they're trying to highlight the weave that is somewhat like the 3-to-1 herringbone twill that Father John mentioned as well. And so the Hungarian Pray manuscript, which goes back to, I think, 1190, which is prior to the carbon date, and these poker holes, I think the questioner is asking, doesn't this indicate the shroud's presence even prior to the 1260 to 1390 estimated carbon date by the radiocarbon labs? And yes, it does. I think that's what the question addresses itself to. I'm not sure.
Also about, Mark, about the possibility that what ended up being tested was a patched part. That theory, is that still current? Or
I think he's talking about the invisible reweave, that somehow there's an invisible patch on the shroud that was dated along with the original cloth. And so, and about a third of it roughly is the patch. So you get two 16th century or one 16th century patch with a first century cloth, and the mix is 1260 to 1390, something like that. To the extent this has been tested with X-rays and microscopic testing of the area and X-ray fluorescence and other types of imaging, there's nothing to indicate an invisible reweave. It's all a hypothesis, but you could test it. If you examine the shroud at the molecular level, you could easily examine it, especially if you tested both sides of the cloth. Since their hypothesis came out, they've examined the back side and the front side, and there's no evidence of a patch, of a seemingly invisible reweave. And that's with a number of people looking at both sides of it. But I'm all for testing this and looking at it at the molecular level. Maybe it's true. Let's test it.
And speaking of testing, Tom asked the question, why are the current keepers or owners of the shroud so opposed to allowing further testing with the most modern and accurate instruments?
Hopefully that's a little strong. And the question of examining the shroud at the molecular and atomic levels is a little premature. I like to think that if they saw how these technologies are perfected with a variety of control samples, and I'm talking about testing at the molecular and atomic level with all 7 types of samples to the most extent that you can. I think then and only then, when they look at the results, then it's time to consider the question. So they really haven't rejected it because we haven't developed the technology that could be developed. And if any scientists are out there listening and would like to take part in this, or if any interested people who are out there who would like to help fund this, because this will cost money. We'll have to pay laboratories and scientists to do the work. Even if they're generous with their time, it's still going to cost some money. So if you would like to help develop these technologies, please, my website is on the screen. It's testtheshroud.org. And our email address is testtheshroud@gmail.com. We'd be happy to work with you in any way possible.
Great. We just got a question from Thomas. He said, Mark said human DNA was found on the cloth. What does that tell us other than the obvious fact that it was a man?
It also indicated it was ancient blood, but newer techniques have been devised. I think that DNA test was done in the 1990s at the University of Texas in San Antonio. More specific testing can be done with a sample. However, the shroud itself has been handled and touched and kissed for centuries. People have laid their paintings on them. You actually have female DNA on the shroud, and it's very understandable. In 1534, the Poor Clare nuns put 16 patches on the shroud. And the textile expert who headed the examination in 2000 was Madame Fleury Lamberg. And she and other women could easily have put their DNA on it, because you have to smooth the shroud out and fill its texture and that. Gosh knows what type of, but it's going to be hard to sequence, it's going to be hard to segregate. I think they want about a dozen samples of only one person's DNA samples. I don't think you can really do that, but I think it's not very practical right now to try to take 12 samples just to get an identification, a pure identification. That to me would be way too many samples. And it's all it's going to say is that it's human blood. It's not going to be able to say this is Jesus's, that we can match it to Jesus's DNA. But I would like a more interesting example is let's compare the blood from the Sidarium with the shroud and see if it's the same. That would be interesting.
Have there been any tests on that, comparing the blood on the Sidarium with the blood on the shroud?
We're proposing that in our examinations. You could see if there's a match at the molecular level, and then see what that looks like. That's going to be pretty good. And you can also examine the serum and the internal body fluid, and that might all line up to the same person. I don't know. This is new technology being applied to a couple of relics for the first time. We don't know what we're going to find, but and then you might want to try to do a DNA of those two samples. But why take 12 samples when you already have 2, and you could do some preliminary analysis before that?
Okay, Father Nickolai, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't think so. That's nope.
Okay, I have another question from Tom Sheehan. He says, the narrative about the recovery of the shroud has brought it to Western Europe by a crusader. How could such a special object be transported without attracting attention?
Oh, good question. I mean, if say you had stolen a relic in 13th century Europe, you might do your best to stuff it way down deep in your baggage and not let anyone know you had it. That's the only theory that I've encountered about that, though. It would have been like taken in the frenzy of the sack of a city under siege, and then hidden because of possible repercussions to the person who turned out to have taken it.
The Knights Templars were a very secretive group.
Yeah.
And they might have, and they financed the crusade, or were big financiers of the crusade. They might have, but though a lot of the latest historical thinking is that it just stayed in Constantinople, and the Byzantine Empire was never the same after the sack of 1204. It was never the same. It just was withering and held together, propped up with, funded by the very countries that led the crusade. But it finally just was sent over because they were so far in debt that they sent it to the King of France. I don't know. I don't get in depth on historical. It's still a little soupy. But the latest thinking is that the Crusaders or the Knights Templars probably did not keep it. And it was sent from the Byzantine throne to the French throne, but no one knows for sure.
Okay, thank you. If you have questions, please feel free to post them. We still have a few minutes. But here's another one that I have here from Tom Sheehan. There was some bishop circa 1350 or so who wrote a letter saying that this was definitely not the original burial cloth of Jesus, but a more recent painting. For a long time, that was very influential in the controversy over the authenticity of the shroud. what's the current status of that negative appraisal?
Tom, are you referring to the Darcis memorandum?
I think so, yes. It was bishop of someplace or other, circa 1350-ish or so.
In 1389, Bishop Darcis issues a memorandum. They're not even sure it made it to the Avignon Pope, but he claims that his predecessor, 30-some years previously, named, I think his name was Henry de Poitiers, conducted an investigation of this, and the forger confessed to having painted the shroud. There's no record of any type of investigation in the diocese's records or in the historians of Troyes and Luray, where this exhibit was. There's no mention of the guy's name or his method, and you could scientifically completely refute the shroud is not a painting. Whatever else it is, it's not a painting. They're not even sure this memorandum even went there. All they have is a copy of what at best is a rough draft, and the assumption is made that it was there because later this Avignon Pope says, well, you can still display the shroud, but you can't say it's Jesus's burial cloth. You have to say it's a representation of it. So it's as if maybe he saw the memorandum and he's just trying to placate both sides. We really don't know. But the contents of it are demonstratively false, and at best, it's compounded hearsay. He's saying somebody else said this in the 1350s, and there's no record at all, and there's not even the name of the painter, let alone his method. And plus, you couldn't paint it today. So it may be at the time it held sway, but science says it's not true.
Okay. Does anybody have more questions? And if you want to, you can post them. We're getting close to the end. I'll ask one more question that was posed by Tom Sheehan. Modern, very precise infrared spectroscopic techniques were not available in the 1980s. What additional information do you expect to get from new measurements using such instruments?
If the infrared, visible, and ultraviolet spectrums are examining every inch of the shroud and all the materials on them and between the threads, God only knows how much information you're going to get. But you could identify things like if you see some limestone or pollens or something, you could take them out and then put them on the death size molecular microscope, who would look at it under all those spectrums as well. And I think you'll get a better understanding of everything you're trying to tell from the cloth as a whole, or even a fragment of a material on there, at the macroscopic level and the microscopic level. I think it has a world of information, and some of these tiny particles, like I said, can be examined at the subatomic level as well, and you could just blow the roof off of the subject.
Right. Okay, well, I think we have reached the end of our question and answer, and I would like to switch over to Sister Marisha for the closing. Let me find you here.
Mark was going to offer the closing prayer, and we have one more question from Paul Segura.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah, one more question. I've heard about a computerized 3D scan of the image on the shroud that was used to create a life-size model recently. Can both of you presenters comment on that?
I'm not sure what you're referring to. There's been lots of 3D reconstructions in the form of a computer image and even statuette type of crucifix of how the man looked when he was in the shroud, and some of them are very impressive, really.
Father, do you know of these computerized 3D scans?
Well, I think so. I've seen a couple of them, and I think one of the important things that it shows is that there's and I think Mark touched on this. There's sort of three-dimensional information in the image on the shroud that isn't, say, present in an ordinary photo or 2D picture, right? That this method of scanning the image on the shroud as we have it through whatever computer voodoo there is involved here. There's three-dimensional data that reconstructs a shape like a head or a body in 3D space that this same process, the same equipment or program isn't able to produce from any other two-dimensional image. Does that sound familiar, Mark? Do you know what I'm talking? It's like NASA equipment or something, right?
Yeah.
That measures deep space distances and stuff like that.
You can manufacture a lot of times any image you want on a computer, but the trick is you want to get one that the subject you're examining, you find a true relationship between intensity and distance. And
right, that's what it was.
All right, great, thank you. Sister Marisha, do you have anything to say before we close with a prayer? I have to unmute. There you are.
Yes. Okay. Hello. Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Antonacci, and also Father Nickolai, for a fascinating presentation on the Shroud of Turin, which bears witness to Christ's crucifixion, death, and resurrection. And we from the Office of Consecrated Life, iTest, and the Catholic Medical Association, thank you for joining us. We hope that this presentation on the shroud of our faith enriches your experience of the reality of Christ's resurrection. We also want to let you know that this webinar will be available on the websites of the 3 co-hosting ministries, as well as other resources and events, so please check them out. And most importantly, may our Lord bless and protect you and your families. Let us continue to pray for one another for an end to this pandemic. And we thank you until next time.
Okay.
So, Mark, I don't know if you want to close with a prayer.
Okay, you stole some of my thunder. Admirably you did. I just wanted to pray that that God watches over the scientists and doctors and helps them find an effective vaccine for the coronavirus and every other endeavor that we try to do to help humanity. And this even goes for our research on the Shroud of Turin. No matter what the results are, please help guide us to find the truth wherever that may lay. But more importantly, let us understand that there's no conflict between science and faith. They're compatible, and let us learn that, and let us please guide us and help us as you have your whole for 2,000 years to help us realize that the sacrifice you made for us and the ultimate goal that we could obtain through you and through your sacrifice, that we all find salvation through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Until next time, God bless you. I thank you for joining us.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Hi there, this is Christine Mooney Flynn, host of the Catholic Mama podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join me over on the Catholic Mama. To develop a Christian family and raise children who are, and who, God willing, will continue to be confident Catholics, requires us as parents to be confident in our faith as well. So each week, I dive into topics that help to make sense of the Catholic faith and how to live out that faith in our vocation as husbands and wives, moms and dads. So whether you need help in explaining aspects of Catholic doctrine like the real presence in the Eucharist, or if you're looking for practical ideas on how to live a more Catholic life, my goal is that you'll find the answers and guidance you're looking for over on my show, The Catholic Mama. I hope to see you there.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.